Hello, everyone. My name is Julian Rodriguez, and today I'll be interviewing Professor Peter Bohmer on the state of U.S. politics, society, and economy. Peter and I have already done a couple of interviews in the past, so if you'd like to check those out, be sure to visit my channel. Peter, I thought of introducing you, but I decided it would be best if I let you introduce yourself in your own words.
Okay. Hello, everybody. A lot of solidarity with the people of Argentina, especially those resisting the authoritarianism, right-wing economics that we're also facing in the United States. I grew up in New York and of parents who had very good values, who are Jewish refugees from Austria who barely escaped Hitler, but suffered a lot, and many relatives were killed. Growing up with values about equality of all people, the dignity of all people, but also my parents felt very powerless. And I got very involved in the 60s, first thinking, the United States was basically a good country. The war in Vietnam was a mistake. It was democracy with some discrimination against Black people. But as the movements developed and I got more involved, I began learning more about U.S. imperialism. And I would say probably close to 60 years now, from like 66, 67 to present, I've been very involved in organizing against U.S. imperialism, global solidarity, economic justice at home, with a vision of a anti-capitalist, what I call participatory socialist alternative. For speaking up, I've been arrested many times, spent some time in prison, mainly for anti-Vietnam War things, other issues also. And, the FBI was involved in a lot of repression, attempted assassination. All of that's made me stronger. I've taught economics, more political economy. Most recently, it's at Evergreen State College, a progressive public college in Olympia, Washington, where I've lived since 1987. I've stopped teaching for money. I still teach wherever people ask me to give talks, or even in bars, wherever I am, 5 years ago. And I've been active mainly in the last few years against the U.S. support for Israel's genocidal war against Palestine, and doing a lot of popular education, mainly around capitalism alternatives, both in Olympia, in prisons when I get invited in. And I've also been very involved in support for political prisoners.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And for those interested in exploring Peter's background even more, in our first interview, we discussed his background and these issues and his persecution by the FBI extensively. So be sure to check that out. Now, let's dive into the first section. So I divided the interview into sections according to topics. So first, I would like to discuss the state of the U.S. economy and society. So I would like to begin with a rather broad question, which is nonetheless very relevant given your background as a professor of political economy. So what do you believe is the political economy behind Trumpism? Why did the message of making America great again, bringing back jobs, talking about the U.S., a U.S. that was supposedly ripped off by the world, resonate so much with so many U.S. citizens? And I'm focusing here more on the message rather than on what Trump actually represents, which I believe is quite different from that. But it's important to know why that rhetoric resonated so much.
Okay, very good question. So in the 60s, basically the whole post-World War II period, there was a growth of most people's incomes, some increase in economic equality, both between the working class and the wealthy, as well as between some decline in black to white incomes improved. I did my dissertation, by the way, in kind of political economy of races in the United States and the issue of anti-racism and solidarity. There were some improvements in racial equality, gender also, a huge opening for women, even though all still, women still earn only about 80% of men. So you had these improvements. At the same time, you began to have particularly in the latest 70s, a movement of U.S. corporations abroad and the beginning of deindustrialization in the United States. And even going back to 1968, when Nixon was president, he partly ran on this kind of law and order, so-called silent majority, basically kind of this view that white men, particularly white working class men, are being discriminated against, which is so opposite from the truth. But there was a decline of income. Unions were declining in membership, after basically the 50s. It had a slow decline in that. And so again, even in the late 60s, you began to have a backlash. And the left, which I was very much a part of, I think we didn't really reach the whole population. It's very, very difficult. The country's always been polarized. Then, beginning in the 80s, what I would call, neoliberalism, which, Argentina began, with a vengeance, and Chile with the dictatorships, with Pinochet, the 76 to 83 dictatorship in Argentina. And from Reagan up to Trump, and it grew up, it's kind of this mythical view, the return to the 50s, that make America great again, white men in front, not really talking about class, and what Black people, women walked behind, and the United States was dominant in the world. It was this mythical picture that I think Trump really appealed to. So that's one part of it. An economy of really growing economic inequality, different ways you measure inequality between rich and poor, both income and wealth. So a lot of people kind of finding scapegoats in immigrants, the racial card being played, very patriarchal. Minister, you things like kind of rights for trans people, lesbian, gay, kind of reaction against this. And so that was, I think, the appeal of Trump, this kind of simple view, return to the 50s, people standard of living growing, jobs had left a lot because the whole global capitalism of capital moving around the world and more money being made in finance and less people being able to find decent jobs, I think very much was the appeal of Trump. I don't think it's that different what's been happening a lot in Europe. Even, you see, I'm sure some of the appeal, I've been to Brazil, you see some of the same kind of appeals of people like Bolsonaro and Milei to pass, in Chile. That was a very sad election to me, the recent one there. So is that a good beginning? What would you like to ask me about what I said?
Yes, actually, my follow-up questions touch on a lot of the points that you just brought up.
Okay.
As a personal comment, I could just say that, the grievance that this rhetoric appeals to, in part, has a kernel of truth to it. Because, it does appeal back to a time where, things were not perfect, certainly not for Black people or minorities, but what is called the American dream of, owning a house and a family living on one income was a reality for a lot of people and certainly for workers. Right. So these people certainly point to an actual grievance that society has. Of course, the solutions that they give are, problematic. So let me continue with my next question, which is very related to what we are just saying. So the Trump administration frequently boasts of record stock market numbers with officials or former officials, in the case of Pam Bondi, even using the Dow Jones to deflect from questions on the Epstein scandal. However, if we look closely at this growth, much of it appears to be driven by the artificial intelligence sectors that critics describe aptly, I believe, as a bubble that creates very little jobs, indeed, in many cases, destroys jobs and consumes an enormous amount of energy with its data centers. And on the other hand, also a lot of this growth, or this supposed growth, can be explained by financial trickery such as stock buybacks and asset price inflation, driven by Blackstone, private equity funds buying up lots of American homes. So the real economy seems to tell a very different story. Like, people are struggling to pay rent. Teachers are donating plasma just to survive. home ownership is increasingly out of reach for many. So, we have the great decoupling starting in the 70s, like the K-shape recovery, they call it, where essentially like productivity kept going up, but wages remained stagnant or even declined. And it seems to be accelerating, especially in terms also of regressive tax policies and budget cuts. So my question is, how detached from reality are official metrics like GDP, job growth, poverty measurements from the lived and daily experience of the American public?
Okay, well, first, I'm going to start by, you began with the stock market, and it's, I don't know, it's a myth, but to me, the stock market is reaching all-time highs. That's true, and it has surprised me. But the point I want to make is, if you think of the economy as what are the lives of people economically in terms of wages, what kind of life they're living, what they can purchase, how meaningful their jobs are, even what kind of environment they're living, healthy, etc., cost of living, the stock market has very little to do with that. It's not even necessarily an indicator. You've had many periods where the stock market has grown a lot, but people's wages haven't gone up. So it's true that probably 40% of the population has some stocks through their pension and retirement funds. A lot of people's living for retirement, you can't live on Social Security. And so people have pension funds, but a lot of jobs don't have them. And a lot of those are in stocks. So a lot of people own a few stocks, but stocks, the ownership of stocks, I'm trying to remember the number, but certainly something like 90% of the stocks are owned by the top 10 to 15% of the population. So the stock market going up doesn't affect most people. That's number one. Number two, you mentioned, Julian, the K-shaped economy. I think it's more true now because what you're having in the United States is a pretty stagnant economy in terms of jobs. There isn't really high unemployment in the United States. It's higher than the official numbers. The numbers aren't good because, for example, if you're not looking for work, you're not considered unemployed. Or if you work 10 hours a week, but you want to work 30 or 40, you're considered fully employed. But the unemployment rate understates it, but it always does. But what you see is all because of stocks, like you mentioned, stock ownership being at the top, and also incomes going up for maybe the top 20 to 30% of the population. So this K-shaped economy means that top, let's say 20%, and particularly the top 2% or 1%, their incomes are going up, their consumptions are going up a lot. Even though there's more savings, and then you have the rest of the population, the bottom part of the K, where incomes are pretty stagnant. In other words, if you consider incomes, the real income, the growth of wages, divided by the growth in prices, for a lot of people, particularly in the last few months, incomes are slowly declining. So you see growth of debt, but also, consumption really being concentrated more and more at the top. And I think, again, there's different ways economists measure inequality. It possibly the most inequality, whether you look at income, which is how much people earn in a year, or wealth is how much they own, just incredible growth of inequality, which so far we have this economy, I would say it's stagnant. We're not in a recession like high unemployment. Poverty levels aren't going up. Of course, you hint that poverty is so, what you need to live on is so understated. Rents jogging. For example, I live in Washington State, Northwest United States, and rents like in Olympia are really growing up. Seattle, the average house now costs $800,000 a year, but childcare is even more expensive than rent. So rents are becoming unaffordable. We have a lot of homelessness in the United States, but childcare has gone up even more because of the declining government support for it. I heard estimate, I think it's $23,000, almost $2,000 a month is the average cost of childcare now in Washington. And again, the statistics on poverty for a family of four, it sounds high by Argentina's price, but prices are even higher here. I think it's about in the high 20s is considered the poverty level you just can't live on, because rent alone probably about 15, 16,000 if you're very lucky a year, and probably more. So we have this really unequal economy that certainly stock market is very indicated, even GDP, because again, you think of an economy, let's say, where incomes are relatively equal, and one where all the incomes at the top would have the same GDP, because GDP is also a measure of national incomes. It's two sides of the same coin. So inequality isn't considered. If you consider the money being spent, for example, on the military, right? That's all part of GDP. It's the highest ever now, $1 trillion a year. The United States spends more on the military than the next 10 countries put together. But Hexteth, who's this crazy Christian nationalist defense secretary from Trump, they want to raise it to $1.5 trillion, an increase of $500 billion. And that's in addition to the money they're asking for the war in Iran. The environmental destruction, really living in a climate crisis and just trying to, restore some of the environment, both destruction and the rebuilding are part of GDP. So our GDP is a very inadequate measure of income. Maybe it gives you some indication of how much society could produce, but whether that has much to do with human well-being, it's very limited connection.
Yeah, and also another thing I found out is that we know that the American healthcare system is tremendously inefficient.
Right.
Even being private, supposedly free markets bring efficiency, but of course a universal healthcare system would be even more efficient, because you need less red tape, less bureaucracy to actually get healthcare to people. But all that excess bureaucracy, all those middlemen in insurance companies who are basically there to tell you, oh no, this doctor is out of network, or sorry, I can't approve this treatment, that is counted as growth. That excessive bureaucracy, which actually hurts people and stops them from getting healthcare, is counted as GDP growth. So that's another example of how GDP can be confusing.
Yeah, the United States, even in relation to income as a percentage of GDP, spends about twice as much on healthcare as most European countries do, much more than Canada. But again, we think of economic well-being as what's the quality of health. We have in the United States much higher infant mortality rates, lower life expectancy than many other countries spend far less. So again, if we're thinking of a measure of economic welfare, it shouldn't be how much we spend on healthcare. It should be people's health, right, and how it's going. And I want to add one more thing, which, in terms of your first question, I thought of healthcare. For example, universal healthcare, when you ask people in polls, there's overwhelming support for it. But yet, the other main, so we've talked about Trump a little bit in your first question. I think the Democratic Party, and a lot of parties like it, these kind of centrist parties who feel they gotta meet the needs of corporations, they've been the opposition, and they've been very hesitant, for example, to push for universal health care. It seems that the issue of working class people has really become secondary, whether it's the Democratic Party, the Labour Party in Britain, the Peronists, in Argentina. So it seems to me part of not this easy question, but I think that a party that both really considers the needs of working class oppressed people, but also takes positions on racial justice, anti-war. I think that combination, which to some extent someone like Bernie Sanders, but didn't, the Democratic Party tried to basically sabotage him when he ran for president 16 and 20. He tried to do that. And I don't know if you're familiar or the people who are listening, the mayor of who just won New York, Zoran Mamdani, he ran as a democratic socialist. He was very strong about Palestine, which most Democrats and Republicans are afraid to talk about the humanity of Palestinians against the U.S. support of billions and billions of dollars a year for Israeli weapons. He was very strong about calling it genocide, but he also talked about setting up public grocery stores, free buses, affordability, free childcare. I mentioned how expensive childcare is for all people. So again, he's having a hard time doing it, but he won pretty big as mayor of New York, both combining, I would call, social justice, climate justice, economic justice, and anti-imperialism and global solidarity. And again, a big issue, I think it's seen big in Chile and Argentina too, in the US, this anti-immigrant stuff, which has been really fascism against immigrants now in the US. He was very strong about immigrant justice, and that's probably one of the stronger movements here, even though there's really a lot of fear now by immigrants, particularly ones who don't have papers, even if they've been here 30, 40 years.
There's a lot I could say on everything you just said, but
I'd like to hear
I want to move the interview forward, and maybe on another occasion, and we can, maybe I can just say that money speaks, and well, certainly since I believe it's called Citizens United, right, which legalized essentially bribery. Like bribery. In other countries, like it's illegal, it happens. In the United States, it's legalized. So yeah. It certainly has a lot of pressure, and certainly what happened to Bernie Sanders. I mean, I remember following the elections both in 2016 and 2020, and it was the opposition, the internal opposition within the Democratic Party to Sanders being nominated was really overt. Really, I remember. Someone within the Democratic Party gave Hillary Clinton the questions that she was going to be asked in the Democratic primary debate ahead of the debate so that she could be prepared. So you really had all the Democratic Party machinery against Sanders. He still did really well, but I just find it hard to believe that such a candidate within the existing structure could win. I don't know how you see it.
Yeah, let me say briefly, because I thought about that. You know, I didn't support him because I thought he was too much part of the dominant structure. But then when he debated Hillary and spoke strongly, a topic we talk about U.S. threats against Cuba and Central America, she tried to use this communist thing against him, saying he'd support the Sandinistas, which was a very progressive group in the 80s. You know, I'm critical of Nicaragua today. So I began to support him. And in 20, he really did have a chance. And then Obama, who a lot of people think, you know, the great American hope, who dropped drones all over the world and was much better than Trump, but still he kind of talked before the South Carolina primary. Looked like Sanders really had a chance to get other people to drop out and to coalesce besides Clinton. And that was really significant. I mean, again, I don't think the solution comes just from electing people. I'm more thinking we need movements to lower the vision of a different society. But I think there could have been some real changes under Sanders. And the money thing you said is so important. I mean, it's millions. It's not enough to end Citizens United, but it's like millions and millions of dollars now from these tech bros. You mentioned how much the stock market is concentrated between APEC, cryptocurrency, which is a whole other issue what some people, including Trump, are making millions from, and tech. So much money is going to getting candidates who support cryptocurrency, who support unregulated AI, and certainly who support Israel.
Certainly. Okay, I'm going to ask one last question about the economic aspect, and then we'll move on to foreign policy. Okay, we already sort of touched upon this issue, so maybe if you feel like you've already answered part of the question, you can just give a brief answer. But I'd like to discuss U.S. fiscal policy as a reflection of inequality, both in wealth and in political power, particularly focusing on the latest big, beautiful bill, like Trump called it. So, you know, to give some context for our audience, I researched this, correct me if I'm wrong, top individual rates were around 90% from 1944 to 1963. Then during the Lyndon Johnson administration, they went down from 91 to 70% in 65, which is still pretty high, considering that today's rate for highest earners is 37%. When it comes to corporate taxes, the top rate in the 70s was around 48%, and it was graduated, so according to the size of the company. Whereas today, Trump has now imposed or passed a flat rate of 21% for companies. So Trump, both in 2017 with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and now with the Big Beautiful Bill, has consolidated these tax breaks for the rich while cutting back on social services. So could you provide some further context on these changes, particularly on the Big Beautiful Bill and what it means, and tell us what it represents in terms of structural power and inequality in the U.S. And another question more: what alternative tax system and social services should a progressive alternative provide?
Okay, so one small change from what you said. As far as I know, the rate was, you're right, it's called the marginal rate. The 90% after World War II was an income over $1 million. You had meant on the first million you paid less, but over $1 million you pay that. And that's like maybe 10 million today because of the rise of prices. So it hit a relatively small number of people, but it was progressive. Higher income people paid much higher taxes. It started declining under Kennedy. I think it was 63 was the first cut, but you're right. And then there were really big cuts under Reagan. And people called it military Keynesianism, which in some ways is going on. You had these big cuts in taxes. You had a huge increase in the military spending. So the government deficit increased, and that did spur some spending. So you had an economy growing with very unequally on this growth of military spending. There was some cutbacks in social programs under Reagan and under Clinton too, a very neoliberal Democratic Party president who cut, called AF wealth, kind of people, who are very low income. That was cut a lot. It was really cut a lot under Reagan. And then the latest thing, the one Big Beautiful Act, July 25, that went into effect, really lowest income tax for high income people. And just in addition to what you said, what's to me another really obscene thing, capital gains, like making money by investing money in stock market, crypto, the tax rate is much lower than on earned income. I think a maximum is 25%, so it's even lower on capital gains, what's called capital gains, than it is on, let's say, I don't know, a basketball player who makes a lot of money. But so that's one part of the recent thing. But I think as significant is a huge increase in this whole immigration system. In the bill you mentioned, $170 billion, not million, toward ICE, the kind of Homeland Security, Customs Border Patrol, arresting people, locking people up. There's a hunger strike going on right now in New Jersey over people being treated horribly in these privatized corporations like the Geo Corporation that gave Trump millions in the election and now expanding, getting these huge contracts. So you have on the one hand tax cuts for the wealthy. There were small tax cuts for a lot of other people to get people to buy into it, but major cuts in food stamps, which the program comes out of the 60s, where if you have low income, you get some money to buy food, really cuts in the welfare programs, or energy, again, really high energy costs. All those programs even cut, just so crazy. Like up till this bill, if you owned an electric car, you got a subsidy of a few $1,000s to encourage electric cars rather than gas-powered cars. All that was cut, and you have, on the other hand, really big increase in the military and in the immigration system. So it really furthers inequality and power of the people in the defense industries, the oil industry, who got, again, I told you, cutting back subsidies for wind power and other stuff. So what's an alternative? I mean, it seems not that difficult to think. The problem is building the power to make it happen. So, for example, in Washington State, where I live, and it's considered a liberal state, but it has one of the most unequal tax systems in the country. what just passed in the latest legislature is that people who earn not wealth but income over $1 million a year would pay 10% of the income over $1 million. And there's a huge movement against it now, but it has passed the legislature, but it's going to be in the ballot. So to me, we don't even have an income tax. The taxes we have, like in Washington, are mainly sales taxes. Like, I don't know, what tax do you have in Argentina? Do you have a value added tax? So what taxes are in Argentina?
Yeah, we have a value-added tax. So we had significant tax reforms during the 90s. Basically what you're describing happened here. We had a much more progressive tax system. So we know that the value-added tax is really regressive. It hits people, I mean, everyone equally. So you go buy a bag of rice and the rich and poor both pay the same. So yeah.
And exactly. And a lot of the money rich either they invest in stocks or things that they put it in errant tax. So it's a very aggressive system. We don't even have an income tax here. But we did pass this thing now of over $1 million income. And again, the limits of the Democratic Party, they did support it here. But for example, in California, it's going to be, I think, on the ballot in November, because states have a lot of things decide at the state level. There's a thing called the billionaire's tax that people have over $1 billion would have to pay 5% of that in taxes, which again could really help. Like the one here would be used towards schools a lot, low-income programs, but again, almost there's an election for governor in California. As far as I know, not one of the Democrats, certainly not the Republicans, are supporting this billionaire's tax, but it has a lot of public support. So it seems to me, like in Washington, I propose nobody who makes less than the median income would pay income tax, and you'd have a progressive tax and would get rid of the sales tax, like the value-added tax. So it seems easy, but it's like building the power from below to make these taxes happen. I think, again, like there's been a big issue in Olympia about closing the libraries, and people have focused a lot on the mismanagement of the libraries. But the problem is whether it's libraries or schools that become really expensive. I think you need to have taxes on those who can afford it and a program that really meet people's needs. And, I think that's both the taxes and a program that meets people's needs, I think is so important. I call it both. I call it non-reformist reforms and revolution. I think capitalism is a very unjust system that reformers under it are always very limited, but we do need to improve people's lives with people being involved with a vision of a society that could be environmentally sustainable, where work was meaningful, alienation is overcome, and kind of global solidarity.
Yeah, I mean, I view reforms as insufficient given the nature of the system, but necessary. Like you need them to build power and to make people like believe that something can be done, because otherwise people have no sense of their own power. Like unless that is expressed somehow structurally, even with a change in the tax system, people will not believe that they can affect change, right?
Just one thing, and then we can go on. I know today I felt honored. I was invited to speak in 2 8th grade classes, like middle school, and the teacher's very progressive. And it was by a place where we could try to stop ships with war supplies, these striker vehicles going back and forth to Iraq. And I asked them, 8th graders, like what they knew about that, what they knew about the Iran war. And quite a few said it was wrong, even though they didn't know much about it. I talked about Cuba, but then I said, how can we stop it? And it was clear to me there was just this incredible feeling of powerless. The idea of being involved in movements, which I really pushed much more than talking about the war, getting involved, talking to your parents, friends. It just was so out of most of them thinking. They're really, I like these kids a lot, but it just this feeling that we can do something seemed really absent. So I think developing kind of solidarity, building organizations that can work both on reforms and beyond, like you were saying, yeah, I'm very much into that too. And I think too often we separate people only about reforms, only about revolution. I think both are really insufficient.
Absolutely. Okay, let's now move on to foreign policy. I hope we can do all sections. So despite winning in 2016 and 2024 criticizing, because I mean that was part of his campaign rhetoric, right? Trump criticized foreign interventions, what he called forever wars. I mean, they had the Republican debate where he bashed Jeb Bush, if I remember correctly, saying like, hey, your brother got us into Iraq, I would have never gotten us into Iraq, and so on and so forth. Then in 2024, he spent his campaign also criticizing Biden for Ukraine, which, I mean, I believe like he can be criticized for that, but obviously Trump didn't have the good intentions. I mean, so Trump has, however, despite all this rhetoric, Trump has, particularly in this administration, implemented one of the most aggressive foreign policies we've seen in a while, right? So we have seen increased support for Israel and its genocide in Gaza, and also support for Israel in Lebanon, in Yemen, and most recently and most significantly in Iran. He kidnapped the president of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro, and he has pushed for an even more inhumane and brutal blockade of Cuba. We may yet see direct U.S. intervention in Cuba. We just don't know. So do you believe this aggressiveness and bellicosity in foreign policy is an expression of Trump, of Hexek's, of Rubio's ambitions, or is it part of a broader desire by American elites, a broad response by the American elite to what they perceive as a loss of U.S. power globally? And secondly, what have you seen has been the response, the reaction of the American public to Trump's foreign policy?
I could probably do better in the second question than the first.
Sorry, let me clarify. Perhaps the first question was somewhat overly complicated the way I formulated it. You can just comment generally on his foreign policy.
I think it's a really good question. No, I didn't think it was too complicated. I just think I don't have a very full answer on it. The people you talk about, they're not all the same. Hexeth, Rubio, Trump. To me, they're all war criminals, but I think their aims are somewhat different. I think one thing that's common about them, whether we talk about Trump in 17 or 25 or 26, it seems there's no concern about the humanity of other people. Just you see like people like Hexeth and Trump on TV bragging about how many people they killed, very connected to Venezuela and the U.S. invasion when they kidnapped Maduro and Celia Flores. I think the number now is up to with the Pentagon admits 200 people they've killed on these boats, and about 100 boats off, either in the Caribbean or Eastern Pacific, but a lot said, drug dealers from Venezuela, even though no proof, and it just, it's just executing people on the high seas. So I think the lack of concern about humanity of other people, that marks whether it was the no forever wars or forever wars right now. So that's kind of background to it. I think it's also true that the United States is in many aspects a declining power economically. It isn't financially, in terms of the international financial system, it's mainly on the dollar. The dollar still is the dominant reserve currency in the world. That's most trade exchange is done in dollars, even if the U.S. isn't directly involved. So I think the United States still dominates the world financially, and that's one reason they can have these big balance of payments deficits. The United States imports a lot more than exports, not just with China. And clearly militarily, the United States is a dominant country, but we also see the limits of it in some of these wars. But economically, China seems to me, has become the dominant economic power. And sometimes I joke with friends that saying the Trump administration, their secret, allies or controlled by China. I'm joking, but it just seems the whole going back to coal, really pushing fossil fuels, gas, and really trying to do what they can to destroy alternative energy. I don't think alternative energy is the solution to everything, but it's certainly part of the solution. And it seems whether it's the global climate change And again, I mentioned earlier the 50s. It really is maybe trying to use the military for this, trying to restore this economic dominance, which, it's not doing. There are splits in the Republican Party, right? He's on some of the war stuff, but Trump has so much popularity among, I would say, about a third of the population that they're mainly afraid to challenge him. And those who have in the Republican Party have basically been defeated, like this recent election among Republicans, about two right-wing people in Texas, but the one even more disgustingly corrupt and controlled by corporations. Paxson beat the kind of right-wing Republican corner and had been senator for a long time. So
yeah, we also, sorry to interrupt, we also have the case of Thomas Massie, who was
right.
Republican, but like libertarian, very critical of Trump, very critical of Israel, and Trump essentially kept on bashing him, and he recently lost his seat.
Totally, he's totally libertarian. He votes, all these tax things. He's as bad as Trump cutting tax on the wealthy. But I did have some respect for him, and he has now said he's going to release all the wealthy people. I don't know if you know this, from the Epstein files, who they're trying to hide. So we'll see if he actually does that. So that's been a fear, and it really does seem to me it's like overt colonialism, like whether it's Ukraine, trying to say any kind of deals, having their resources with Africa, with Latin America too. It does seem like it's this naked intervention. And basically Trump's openly, he's called it the Donroe Doctrine. It's like the Monroe Doctrine with his name Donald on it, but really says Latin America is under the U.S. purview, and the resources, we want to control the resources. And so to me, that does explain a lot of the intervention. With the wars in the Middle East, I actually see it as, the U.S. and Israel have always been very connected. And I don't think that Israel's controlling the U.S. like some people are arguing. That can often be somewhat anti-Semitic. I think Israel and the U.S. are kind of joint partners in this idea to dominate the Middle East. And even though Trump spoke against the wars, he originally, if you go back to 2003, he originally supported the war in Iraq. So he's kind of changed history. He is zero. The truth means nothing. I don't often trust what Iran says, but I trust their statements far more than I do the Trump administration. And you mentioned Rubio and Hegseth. I think with Rubio, he has been committed to basically have all of Latin America being neo-colonies, with Cuba being the big enemy. And I think even the attacks on Venezuela, the invasion of Venezuela, the kidnapping of Maduro, and giving a government that really has become like a neo-colony of the United States. Trump's talked about making Venezuela the 50th state of the U.S., and they're getting all these deals on oil and oil and mines. So I think with Rubio, it's a lot ideological. For Trump, it's probably more issue of power and the economy. So I don't know if that helps in the answer. It's kind of, and I think Hegseth really is this Christian nationalist who wants to have this kind of white Christian dominance, who brags about people dying as if he was talking about a game of pool. In terms of the response, it's something which has been kind of troubling. I said I've been involved really in global solidarity, anti-war stuff since the 60s, when I realized Vietnam was more than a mistake, but it was kind of systematic history of U.S. intervention around the world. And I really recommend, by the way, this book in terms of Latin America, America by Greg Grandin, that goes to the history of the Americas and a lot on U.S. intervention in Latin America. And so I think the Hegseth just, again, controlled power. The military are really big supporters. The military companies, they profit by it. But in terms of the movements here, and I said I've been involved a lot, there's overwhelming opposition to the U.S. support for Israel. And I've been very involved in, trying to do education. It's really a change, I guess, all over the world, that Israel's really genocidal war. I mean, I think what's going on in Gaza and even the West Bank, the settlers, sadly, a lot from the U.S., Jewish people from the U.S., the Israeli military, more and more killing people. Over 1,000 people have killed in the West Bank since October 2023. The Lebanon war. They're not popular in the United States. The same is true with the war in Iran, the Venezuela, but there really isn't much of a movement. And so this passive opposition, but for reasons I don't fully understand, I give a lot of talks, and I think it's just powerless, or maybe like with Iran, it officially started 3 months ago, yesterday, the latest war. There was a short one in June, and then the U.S. Attacks with Israel together, since February 28th. And Trump's saying it's almost over negotiations. So maybe people don't know, they think the war's going to end, so why protest? A feeling of powerlessness. And I think a mistake of some of the anti-war movement, even going back to the 60s, was like a very common slogan was bring the troops home, bring the troops home. And I mean, 55,000 U.S. soldiers died in Vietnam, but over 2 million Vietnamese did. And it seems, to me, opposition also be all lives of equal value. And one of the things that I think the U.S., I call it the ruling class, those in power, foreign policy establishment, the military, the kind of leaders of both parties, I think their view is, as long as U.S. soldiers don't die, we can do almost anything. And Johnson and Nixon called it Vietnamization, changing the corpse to Vietnamese, which is so inhuman, wrong. But if we look at the U.S. wars now, in June when the United States attacked Iran, I don't think any U.S. people died, maybe one or two. In this recent war that's still going on, it's not, they call it a ceasefire, but it's attacks, particularly on Lebanon by Israel. When you have all this U.S. money, the U.S. claims about 15 soldiers have died. It may be more. Thousands of Iranians have died. I think 3,000. Same in Lebanon. It's not the U.S. directly in Lebanon, but it's Israel with U.S. weapons. And, a fifth of the population in Lebanon has been displaced. So I think it's been very hard, the lack of U.S. casualties, people not knowing about the war, a society where a lot of, in the 60s, we had a lot of anti-war organizations that could grow. There aren't those organizations that much now. I think we need to build organization that when movements erupt, which I still have confidence, we'll be able to move things forward. I think it's mixed. It's called No Kings. There've been a few groups, somewhat tied to Democratic Party, somewhat independent, that had big protests against Trump because the whole authoritarianism, which means both at home and abroad, there is a lot of fear. And March 28th, for example, there were 7 million people in the U.S., my estimates, that came to these No Kings protests. And people tend to be, somewhat progressive, lots of immigrant justice, even anti-war. But a lot of the organizers, I think, they're still very much tied to the Democratic Party. They're afraid to protest. In Olympia, with a lot of pressure, I did speak about these wars the U.S. are going on. But in most places, like friends of mine in San Diego, in New Jersey, said it was very anti-Trump, but nothing about U.S. imperialism or U.S. wars. So, but I do think people are speaking, or at least going to it. I think we need to do more than just mobilize people, but build movements that can really challenge what's going on, which is really, I think, so destructive. We really are dealing with a lot of crises right now, including the crisis of democracy.
Yeah, I think a key difference with the 60s was the draft, right? So in the 60s, you had the draft, and so people's sons were going to Vietnam, being taken. So I think that was a huge change in terms of bringing pressure, to American families in terms of what's going on. But I also see, I mean, it's been quite remarkable to see how opinion polls completely shifted on Israel, right, before and after the genocide. And I think that a key difference here in our day is phones. I mean, we had a genocide live streamed that everyone could access on their phones all day. I mean, we could all see all around the world what Israeli bombs were doing, what the Israelis were doing in Gaza, what they're doing in Lebanon, and so on and so forth. So that sort of brings the conflict closer. And I will also, like, I'm obviously saying this as someone who, I mean, I haven't been to the US ever, but I did see a lot of campus protests during the Biden administration and during the early Trump administration, and Trump cracked down really hard on them. But yeah, I mean, in general, I think that it's something about the age also, which is not just exclusive to the United States, but globally, in that people can feel a lot of outrage about things, but we are all like with our phones, we're all living in our separate reality. And that's where the importance of actually like getting together physically with people and having conversations face to face, that's where it really comes in, because otherwise it's just, it's just anger and indignation that goes nowhere,
And this is interesting, talking about colleges, a few things, and just trying to reach people today. I think among students, and even more generally among young people, not only students, compared to the 60s, there's as much belief about how corporations don't have people's interests in mind, that the government is basically for the rich, by the rich, for the rich, kind of the problem, not the solution, even though I think it should be the solution. But I think there was hope more in the 60s that people could change things. And now, even though criticism might even be stronger, but it's kind of a cynicism, lack of power, feeling of powerlessness, which I think we need to do much more door to door. Even like a lot of the left groups, everything is on, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. And to me, I've always been more into getting people together, going out to where people are. The other things that, in terms of repression, so when I mentioned lack of a movement now, there was, and I think really positive at many, mainly colleges, but also in communities in late 23, 24, right? Hamas attacked Israel in October 7th, 23, and then Israel began this incredibly bombing attack the next day, which really destroyed Gaza. And, probably 5% of the population were being killed by the Israelis, and many more wounded or still under the rubble, and we don't know. So there were like these sit-ins, occupations at many colleges. And, there was quite a bit of repression. Colleges have changed the rules, but there was repression in the 60s. So I do think the fear is real, particularly when we talked at the beginning of the interview about jobs. Students used to feel like, at least if you studied stuff like science, business, you could get a jobs. And with artificial intelligence, a lot of those jobs aren't there. So it's even more fear now than there was before. And I would add in, Trump administration has really stepped up the taking money from schools like UCLA, Columbia, where there was protests, using this thing of anti-Semitism. It's so weird. Anti-Semitism has mainly been something of the right, the fascists, and a lot of these Trump administration who are really, anti-Semitic themselves have been using anti-Semitism, which is a real thing, but so exaggerated to use it against college, like a lot of elite schools like Harvard, Columbia, UCLA, Berkeley, Michigan, etc. But I think, to me, almost more pathetic is what I call self-censorship. Yes, repression is real, but certainly among schools, administrations who are concerned about their endowments, faculty, I don't know if coward is the right word, but I guess I think it's self-censoring, so claiming to be afraid of what's going to happen to them that they do everything that the Trump administration wants, like this whole attack on diversity, putting classes on racism, saying to talk about racism in the United States is reverse racism, which is so absurd. So cutting out a lot of history, but a lot of schools just going along with it without speaking up. And again, to me, students can change the world, but student movements have been so significant in being part of the solution, and they're not that strong now, and they're much weaker even than they were in 23, 24, you asked about. But I have hope still, because of like you mentioned, and I mentioned, the lack of support for Israel. People's values a lot seem to be progressed in a lot of ways. So I think we need to have hope and not give up, but it is a difficult period in the whole world.
Yes, well, there's a lot I would like to say and everything you just said, but I want to be mindful on time, so okay. I want to move on to the electoral politics section.
Okay, good.
So in your articles, you point out the many flaws of the Democratic Party, while at the same time stating that third-party options have been, at least in the case of Jill Stein and the Green Party, a dead end in terms of electoral politics. There seems to be a rise in apathy in large sections of the U.S. population and of the Democratic base. So in 2024, like you point out in your articles, we saw a decrease in voting for Democrats in areas and states that have traditionally been Democratic. So these are votes that didn't necessarily go to Trump, but just people who used to vote Democrat who stopped voting, right? You point out how the Democrats have appealed too much to the professional managerial class while being reluctant to advance truly progressive agendas, both domestically and in foreign policy. Following the Iran war, which I don't know if we can say it has ended, we don't know what will happen there, Trump has also lost a lot of support, both due to him walking back on his isolationist rhetoric, and also, more importantly, even gas prices. So right. Affordability, according to the latest polls, is, I think, number one in terms right. of the issues that people care about. So I wanted to ask you, first of all, where do you see the Democratic Party? Do you see it as a viable instrument of change, as a party that can be either changed from within or pushed from without? Do you see third-party options as viable? And well, what's your view on this assessment that I just gave?
Okay, so I'm pretty critical of the Green Party. It seems so much the focus is the presidential elections, right? And kind of mobilizing people unsuccessfully at the elections. It seems to me developing a third party really would be at a base. I call it kind of social movement parties that are involved in social movements that have an electoral aspect, but it's not the dominant thing. And, I've been reading this book, I can't remember the name, by Molly Krafloff, The Bund, to be a Jewish socialist group. A Country is Where We Live, I believe is the title. But anyway, it talks about a group, the Bund, being very anti-Zionist in Eastern Europe, Russia, but had electoral, had the schools, bars, clubs, armed self-defense, and electoral too. And I think we need something like that. It's very, very difficult. So I do think that's one important aspect, a party of a new type where electoral wasn't the main part, but was very involved in a lot of the issues we've been talking about today, and also runs candidates. So I think that's needed. But I think to do that, probably not the national level. Within the Democratic Party, there is some hope. I think at the top, if we look at the leadership, it still seems pathetic, like Schumer's the head of the Democrats, the Senate, voting for every Israeli event, so tied to Wall Street, and Jeffries, both in New York, the head of the House, being almost as bad. But you do see candidates like AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar. There are really quite a few, Rashid Tlaib, of Democrats who have come out of organizing. They seem somewhat tied to the base and are not afraid to criticize, U.S. support for Israel, not afraid to talk about health care for all, willing to talk about immigrant justice. And So to me, that's very positive, and I support them, particularly since movements aren't that strong. I do think people working on these progressive candidates, not the old corporate Democrats, and it does seem to be happening in a growing number, like in Michigan, this guy running for Senate, Saeed, even the person in Texas, a very Republican state, Tallarico, a white kind of Christian, but not a right-wing Christian. So there really are something going on. It's small, but it's growing. Even in the last vote in the Senate, the overwhelming majority of Democrats voted against this increased aid for Israel. And still it didn't pass because all Republicans, and even this War Powers Act, which says that Congress would have to go along with wars, which is basically the law since the Vietnam War, but always not held. Both the Democrats and Republicans in power haven't paid attention, but you have an increasing number of senators and people like Massey, even one or two Republicans, who are supporting all the War Powers Act. So I see some hope there. Trump support is really declining. And I think you mentioned some of the reasons. So, the largest group in the United States that not kind of white are Latinos. I know it's not a race, but the whole thing, there's only one human race, but Latinos, about 20% of the population now. And you had a lot of increase for Trump, particularly in the 24 election, where he didn't get a majority, but probably for most polls, well over 40% of the vote. And even among African Americans who've been since the 30s, when they switched from Republican to Democrat, the ones who could vote have been overwhelmingly Democratic. And Trump made inroads, particularly among working class people, the jobs you mentioned, and even among young people, Black, white, Latino, Asian American. And it seems that support has really declined. If the elections are fair in 26, so in 26, just in 6 months from now, less 5 months, you have elections for all of Congress, like 435 representatives, and for a third of the senators. And both are controlled by Republicans by a very small majority. It seems if the elections are, just fair in terms of not trying to stop people from voting, the Democrats, again, with all the limitations, but not as bad as Republicans, will win the House, and they have a chance for the Senate. I said a third of the candidates are up, which I think would to some extent limit the Trump administration, even though they've really been ignoring Congress. So I do think these elections are important. I am afraid, they're going to call a state of emergency because they know the polls too, and Trump is doing really bad. He says he doesn't care. He's more, I think, about his power and himself. But I think the elections in 26 and the next presidential election are in 28. And again, most of the Democratic Party seems to appoint, again, a neoliberal war hawk. But, like AOC, who I mentioned, I hope she runs. And, again, she's trying to be a good Democrat, so definitely limitations. But, she is positive. I think if the Democratic Party really made economic justice, anti-war, anti-AI, which we haven't even talked about, the artificial intelligence, was a lot of opposition to these data centers. I do think if they could win the election. It's very important, again, that we do what we can. So this isn't like really blocking people from using ICE or other ways at the polls. There's a lot of fear of that among people too. But I think the support for Trump has really declined. Particularly among people, I think, who are not hardcore MAGA people, but people around the economy, or just because the Democratic Party seems so establishment, either didn't vote, like you mentioned earlier, Julian, or voted for Trump. So that does seem to have changed, even among relatives of mine, like, people from my wife's side of the family who are Mexican. Some of them, particularly some of the men who had voted for Trump before, they said, how could they have been so stupid? So we'll see what happens. So I'm slightly hopeful, but I just wish the Democrats would be somehow a real opposition party, which the leadership, they definitely haven't been, but there are those cracks I mentioned.
Yeah, from an outsider's point of view, like just knowing the basics of how the U.S. electoral system works, it's really hard to get outside of the two-party system unless you go. I think that there's more leeway, there's more space at the local level, like city and state level. And that would probably be a smart way to begin building like a third party and slowly build power there. But I don't know. I would like we have just a little bit of time left. So can I ask you one last question?
Yeah, so I was trying to say what you said. I do think there are possibilities. Again, going back in U.S. history, I mean, there were two parties, both very pro-slavery parties, and the Republican Party then with Lincoln broke some from the slavery and then became the other major party. So it's been very, very difficult. Most third parties have done really poorly. But I was saying, and you were agreeing, like building from the bottom up at the local level, again, being involved both in local issues, national and global, because even in Olympia discussion, a lot of people say, oh, people don't care about the global. I do think living in the United States, that's part of our responsibility. I'm going to tell really quickly before your last question. I remember I spent a lot of time in Nicaragua in the 80s when they had the Sandinistas who I had a lot of hope for. I think sadly, they have the rhetoric today, but not the politics, even though against U.S. intervention. I remember once going to a celebration and people were saying there, we hate U.S. imperialism, but then they said, we separate the American people, or I would say the U.S. people from the U.S. government and corporations. Then they said, I want to say anything. And I said, thank you very much for saying that. I'm from the U.S., but I think it's our responsibility to make the difference bigger between the U.S. government and corporations and the people here. So I think that's our responsibility here. And we can't just talk about affordability. At least we have to connect it very much to what's going on globally.
Great. So there are some issues which sadly we couldn't touch upon. I wanted to discuss Cuba with you, but maybe perhaps we can do it on some other occasion. I would like to end with something that you repeat in your articles that comes out. I mean, I read a lot of your work in preparing for this interview, and you always stress the importance of being able to have conversations with people we disagree with, and that we shouldn't, or U.S. citizens shouldn't demonize those who voted for Trump. I mean, at least not the working class people among them. So what would you say to a Trump voter who is struggling to make ends meet and having a hard time in general? Like, how would you seek to reframe his or her thinking about the problems that they face?
Okay, I think a very important question. I think it's so important we reach not everybody, but I think people who are not totally racist, fascist, and most people are very contradictory. Right? They have good values, both. My approach, I'd say, probably when I say a teacher, I realize I'm a teacher, whether I'm in a class or in a local bar talking to people. And I always try to find, like, first, what do I agree with people? Like, again, saying that they're having it hard and, let's say the Democratic Party didn't care about them. Their lives got worse under Biden. Finding points of unity, what are similar. And I try to ask or talk to them and try not to lecture, is try to ask people, kind of try to understand why they believe what they believe. And then trying to present an alternative, like saying, like immigrants, aren't the enemy, and maybe giving one or two figures about showing that and saying, what are some of the solutions? And, and again, to me, a really big word is solidarity. And I find a lot of people, they have some really good values, but then it ends up in this right-wing way. So again, finding the commonality, understanding what they believe, and then challenging people with a different view of the world, but doing it respectfully. I've done a lot of talks in prison, and my background is pretty different. Very few prisoners have finished high school in the United States. Most of the people of color. But I think treating people respectfully, challenging their ideas, but respecting them as human beings. And I've seen enough people changing. I mean, I've changed. I certainly didn't have these views when I was a kid, in the 50s. And so I guess that's being respectful, challenging people respectfully, presenting alternatives. I think those are some of the lessons. And again, really stressing, I think, reaching out. Like lately, I know the group I work with, Economics for Everyone, we do these programs. And the last one we did about Iran and Cuba, only about 45 people came. Some were very happy, but I was thinking we really have to go out to reach people, like try to go into churches, even groups that aren't that friendly to us. If we could try to get invited and speak to people there, and not just relying on social media. So I don't know, those are, and building organizations that are welcoming to people also, because I think people really change when they get involved.
Absolutely, and I completely agree with everything you said. I mean, over the years, I
Good.
have learned to listen before I speak when it comes to people I disagree with, because I
Right.
find that if you first go for the lecture,
Right.
and the other person has a really different ideology to you, you'll like build a wall between you and them.
Totally.
Whereas if you first ask them, okay, why do you think this? What do you think about that? You create an avenue for an actual discussion. So I absolutely agree with everything you said.
And one last thing, I like to tell stories too. I think sometimes, you know, people don't change that quickly, but we can plant seeds. This was when I was a teacher. This was really a long time ago, 2008, I think it was, during the financial crisis, when a lot of people lost their homes. And I had a student in my class at Evergreen State College, an economics class, and he was so hostile to me. He said, "Oh, I hated banks. I just talked against rich people," even though my analysis is almost more systemic. It's not the people, it's more the structures. And he wrote me a really bad evaluation. He didn't have grades, he wrote evaluations. And then maybe 10 years later, he wrote me back saying he apologized, quote, for being an asshole in my class. And he said he just wanted to be a banker, and he'd gone to work for Wells Fargo, one of the really big banks. And he said they were so much worse than what I had said, but he wasn't ready to hear it then. So my point of, and he apologized a lot. I never met him afterwards, but he did. And I think the thing is, sometimes you can plant seeds, like whether like U.S. history, so much stuff in Argentina, such a mixed history, that maybe people, when they have experiences later on, it can affect them.
That's a really great story you just told. Peter, it's been a pleasure to have a talk with you again. Perhaps we can do this again so we can discuss Cuba and all the other issues which we couldn't discuss today. I will put links to your work in the description of the video once I post it. So it's been wonderful. Thank you very much for giving me your time.
Actually, I always enjoy talking to you too, and I'm always impressed how much you know about the U.S. too. Sadly, a lot of people in other countries know a lot about the U.S. People in the U.S. know very little about other countries for the most part. So anyway, I always enjoy talking with you too. I hope I didn't talk too fast.
No, not at all. Everything was wonderful. Okay. We'll see. I guess I'll see you soon.